After nearly a half-century of investigative efforts, we have identified the oldest unidentified homicide victim in Massachusetts, known as the Lady of the Dunes. She is Ruth Marie Terry from Tennessee.
A notorious mystery that's gripped the Cape for decades is now case closed. 37-year-old Ruth Marie Terry was found dead in Provincetown back in 1974.
There is a particular category of violence that announces itself not through chaos, but through deliberateness. Through the slow, methodical removal of every feature that would allow a human being to be identified. Not a crime of passion, not an impulsive act, a project. A considered technical procedure carried out on a woman who was already dead, or very nearly so, in the dunes behind Race Point Beach in Provincetown, Massachusetts, at some point in the summer of 1974. Her hands were amputated at the wrists. Several of her teeth had been extracted. Her skull was crushed on the left side. Her head had been nearly severed from her body. She was then arranged face down on a beach towel, her folded jeans placed under her head like a pillow, in a stand of scrub pine about a mile east of the Race Point Ranger Station, just beyond the reach of the tourists who filled Cape Cod every summer, in a geography isolated enough to do its work of concealment across days and then weeks before anyone found her. The person who did this understood exactly what they were doing and exactly why. They understood that in 1974, before DNA forensics existed as an operational investigative tool, before digital databases connected fingerprint records across state lines, before genetic genealogy existed as a concept, the two most reliable methods for identifying an unknown body were fingerprints and dental records. They removed both. They then left the body in one of the most tourist-saturated regions in the American Northeast, in a landscape that received visitors from across the country and around the world every summer. Which meant that the absence of a match in local missing persons records was not evidence of local origin. The geography produced the anonymity. The mutilation locked it in place. The combination was nearly permanent, as it turned out. It lasted 48 years. The woman's name was Ruth Marie Terry. She was born on September 8, 1936, in a mountainside shack in Whitwell, Tennessee. She was 37 years old when she was murdered. She was known only as the Lady of the Dunes from July 26, 1974, until October 31, 2022. The man who murdered her died in California in 2002, 20 years before science finally restored her name. He lived those 20 years freely, without arrest, without charge, without accountability of any kind, because the system that should have stopped him in 1960 had let him go. And the system that should have identified his victim in 1974 had not yet developed the tools to do so. This is a story about a woman who was erased, about the man who erased her, and the earlier erasures he had committed before the system had a chance to stop him, and about the 48 years it took a name to travel from a beach towel in the dunes back to the family in Tennessee that had never stopped being hers. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you follow cold cases like this, liking the video really helps. Consider subscribing to the channel to help keep these stories alive. Now, let's take a closer look at the erasure of Ruth Marie Terry and the man who thought he had made it permanent. Provincetown sits at the absolute tip of Cape Cod, at the end of the long curved arm of sand that extends into the Atlantic off the southeastern shoulder of Massachusetts. Getting there requires either the 2-hour ferry from Boston across the open water of Cape Cod Bay, or the long drive down Route 6 through the towns of the Upper and Mid-Cape before the road narrows and the land thins and the ocean begins to appear on both sides simultaneously, the bay to the west and the open Atlantic to the east, until you arrive at a place that is more water than land, more light than shadow, more salt air than anything else. Provincetown in the summer of 1974 was at the height of its particular fame. It had been an artist's colony since the early 20th century. It had been a Portuguese fishing community before that. By 1974, it was both of those things simultaneously, and several others besides. and a place where Bohemian culture and New England tradition coexisted in the way they do, only in places where the physical isolation has made social tolerance a practical necessity. The town was small. Its commercial street ran for 3 miles and contained most of what there was to contain: galleries, restaurants, guest houses. In summer, the population expanded from a few thousand year-round residents to tens of thousands of visitors, which meant the town was simultaneously intimate and anonymous, a place where you could know everyone and no one in the same afternoon. The dunes at Race Point Beach are something else entirely. They are not the civilized beach of the town's shoreline. They are the dunes of the Cape Cod National Seashore, protected federal land, an expanse of wind-sculpted sand and scrub pine and beach grass that stretches for miles along the northernmost shore of the peninsula, facing the open Atlantic. They are beautiful in the specific, indifferent way of wild landscapes that do not care about human presence. The light on the dunes changes all day. The wind is constant and speaks in the vegetation. The distance from the parking areas to the remoter stretches of the dunes is enough to guarantee privacy to anyone who seeks it. And there are people who go to the dunes for exactly this reason, who walk past the crowds at the public beach and into the landscape beyond, where the only company is the sound of the water and the sky. It was into this landscape that 12-year-old Leslie Metcalf walked with her family and their friends on the afternoon of July 26, 1974. The group had been hiking back toward the parking area when the friend's dog became excited by something in a stand of pines about a mile east of the Race Point Ranger Station. Leslie went to see what had caught the dog's attention. That was when she found the Lady of the Dunes. She was face down on a beach blanket. Her Wrangler jeans were folded and placed beneath her head, a detail so controlled, so deliberate, that it reads not as arrangement, but as staging. A blue bandana was also present. She was nude. She had been dead for between 10 days and 3 weeks. The left side of her skull was crushed. Her head had been nearly severed from her body. Her hands were gone. The sand and the beach blanket around her were undisturbed, which meant she had not been killed there. She had been brought there, placed there, arranged there, by someone who then left. The stand of pines had done its work. The weeks had done theirs. And a 12-year-old girl walking with her dog had undone them. Leslie ran back to her parents. Her father went to verify what she had described. He then contacted the park rangers. By the time the Provincetown Police Department, the Massachusetts State Police, and the National Park Service had all responded to the scene, the July afternoon was already fading. What they found gave them very little to work with. No fingerprints, because there were no hands. No dental comparison, because several teeth had been removed. No identification documents, no jewelry, no personal effects of any kind. An estimated age range of 20 to 45. Reddish auburn hair, shoulder length, in a ponytail, pink painted toenails. 5 feet 6.5 inches tall, approximately 145 pounds. She was buried in St. Peter's Cemetery in Provincetown, under a marker that read, "Unidentified female body found Race Point Dunes, July 26, 1974. Her head was retained separately by law enforcement for the ongoing investigation. The cemetery gave her a place in the ground. The marker gave her a date. It gave her nothing else, because there was nothing else to give." Ruth Marie Terry was born into a life that required early resilience. Whitwell, Tennessee sits in Marion County, in the hill country of southeastern Tennessee near the Alabama and Georgia state lines, coal mining country. There are a landscape of ridges and hollows and small communities that had grown up around the extraction economy and had been living with the consequences of that economy for generations. Her father, Johnny Red Terry, was a coal miner. Her mother, Ava, died when Ruth was very young, at only 23 years old. Ruth was raised largely by her grandparents, which is how many children in that era and that geography were raised when circumstances required it, not out of indifference, but out of necessity, the practical reallocation of children to the household that could manage them. She had a brother named James, who would become the person who fought hardest for her in the years after she disappeared. James Terry was Ruth's protector, the word her family used without hesitation. I'm the older sibling whose relationship to his sister was defined by a loyalty that would eventually lead him to hire a private investigator, fly to California in search of her, and spend years pushing against the walls of an investigation that had nothing to push back with. He did all of this without knowing she was already dead. He did all of this for a woman who was already in the ground in Provincetown with no name on her marker. Ruth was also a mother, though that chapter of her life was known only to a few people for many years. In 1958, when she was 21 years old and working at a Fisher body plant in Livonia, Michigan, making interior parts for General Motors vehicles, she gave birth to a son. His father is listed as unknown in the records. Unable to care for the infant financially, she arranged his adoption by her workplace superintendent, Richard Hanchett Sr., whose wife Thelma also worked at the plant. The adoption was finalized in exchange for Hanchett Sr. paying off Ruth's expenses. After the adoption, Ruth left Michigan and moved to California. She tried to reconnect with her son in 1972. He was unavailable at the time. They never met. Her son, Richard Hanchett Jr., grew up knowing he was adopted, knowing his birth mother was from Tennessee, knowing almost nothing beyond that. He spent decades searching for her. In 2018, hoping to find her, he took a DNA test through Ancestry.com. What the DNA test eventually helped establish was that the woman he had been looking for had been lying in St. Peter's Cemetery in Provincetown since 1974. Between 1958 and 1974, the middle years of Ruth Terry's life. She moved through California, circled back to Tennessee, remarried, divorced, and eventually found herself, in February of 1974, standing in a clerk's office in Reno, Nevada, marrying a man who introduced himself as Guy Rockwell Moldavin, antiques dealer, who was 6 feet 3 inches tall with broad shoulders and a barrel chest, who was brilliant and charming and a captivating storyteller, who had been married before and who was the most dangerous person Ruth Marie Terry had ever met. Guy Rockwell Moldavin was born on October 27, 1923, in New York. His parents were Albert and Sylvia Moldavin. His father had been a trader and industrial expert on Wall Street for 23 years before eventually retiring to Provincetown, Massachusetts, of all places, where he lived in what was described in a 1939 Worcester Telegram article as the oldest house in Provincetown. This connection to Provincetown is not incidental. It meant that Guy Moldavin knew the geography. He had grown up with a father who owned property there. He knew the dunes, the remoter stretches of the national seashore, the distances that provided privacy, the landscape that guaranteed that anything placed within it with sufficient care would not be found easily. Moldavin was educated privately and in Swiss and Connecticut schools, the kind of education that produces in certain people a certain surface polish, a fluency in the manners and references of privilege that can make a man seem like more than he is to people who are not looking carefully. He was, by multiple accounts across multiple decades, extraordinarily magnetic. A flirt, a storyteller, a man who could hold a room with the confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own charm. In Seattle, in the late 1950s, he opened an antique shop under an alias, Raoul Guy Rockwell. That became a gathering place for beatniks and artists and celebrities, and the curious, open in the evenings, filled with the kind of curated bohemian atmosphere that a man of his particular skills could generate and sustain indefinitely. He was, a New York Daily News profile from 1960 would describe him, a hipster, a bunco artist, and a great lover. The bunco artist was the important part. Moldavin's second wife, Manzanita Aileen Ryan, went by the nickname Manzi. She was a vivacious redhead, in Ann Rule's description, Rule, and the true crime author who had briefly been a Seattle police officer and who devoted a chapter of her 2008 book, Smoke, Mirrors, and Murder, to Moldavin's history. Manzi had a daughter from a prior marriage, 18-year-old Dolores Ann Mearns. The three of them lived together in Moldavin's 2-story lakeside home in Seattle, where the antique shop rarely opened its doors before 6 in the evening, and where Moldavin held court for the city's beatnik community in the hours that followed. Then, in the spring of 1960, something happened at the house on Fairview Avenue. Between April 1st and April 3rd, 1960, Manzanita and Dolores both vanished. Moldavin told people they had left. He described the departure as voluntary, in the vague, shrugging terms of a man who had decided that his wife's absence did not require detailed explanation. Then, within weeks, he filed for divorce from Manzanita on the grounds of desertion. On July 29, 1960, he married a new woman, Evelyn Marie Emerson, the stepdaughter of a woman named Germaine Winkler, with whom Moldavin had become smitten when the Winklers came into the antique shop. He also borrowed $10,000 from Evelyn's stepmother, Mrs. Germaine Winkler, ostensibly to buy antiques in Canada. He then drove to Provincetown under a new alias, Michael Strong, using his father's property there as a staging point, and kept the $10,000. When he failed to return from the supposed buying trip, the Winklers reported him. Manzanita's first husband, William Mearns, who had been concerned about the disappearance of his ex-wife and his daughter, went to the Seattle police. In late August 1960, 2 detectives executed a search warrant at the house on Fairview Avenue. Both women's wardrobes were still in the house. Their personal effects were still in the house. Everything they would have taken with them if they had left voluntarily was still there. The only things that had left that house were Manzanita and Dolores themselves. Then detectives found the septic tank beneath the structure. It had been sealed with what looked like fresh concrete. When the concrete was broken, investigators found bits of flesh and bone and strands of hair inside. According to Ann Rule, Moldavin had murdered both women, dismembered them in the attic of the house, and disposed of their remains across 2 locations. Fragments of Dolores were found in the septic tank, and Manzanita's legs were recovered from the Columbia River, fished out one at a time. He had done this methodically, as a project, in his own home, and then sealed the evidence under concrete, filed for divorce on the grounds of desertion, remarried within weeks, and attempted to steal $10,000 from his new mother-in-law on the way out. The FBI located Moldavin in December 1960 in his curio-cluttered Greenwich Village apartment in New York. The arrest ended a nationwide manhunt. He reportedly wept when they took him in. He denied killing either Manzanita or Dolores. He denied everything. And the King County prosecutor, looking at the evidence in front of him, human remains in a septic tank and a river, no confirmed cause of death, no witnesses, a defendant who had been successfully mobile for months across multiple states, concluded there was not enough to charge Moldavin with murder. Not enough for the standard the law required. He was charged instead with unlawful flight to avoid giving testimony before a grand jury concerning the mutilation of a human body. Then, for the theft of the $10,000, he was convicted of grand larceny and sentenced to 15 years. In 1962, on appeal, he agreed to repay the stolen money. He was released. He walked out of a legal system that had found human remains in his septic tank and convicted him of theft. And then he changed his name back and moved across the country and lived his life for the next 12 years. And in February of 1974, he married Ruth Marie Terry in Reno, Nevada. This is the specific, structural, annihilating failure at the center of this case. Not an individual detective who made a bad call. Not a single bureaucratic oversight. Or a prosecution that looked at the evidence of 2 murders. 2 women who had lived with this man and then been found in pieces in the ground beneath his house, and concluded that the legal standard for murder could not be met, and let him go. And the man who was let go did not change. He was not rehabilitated. He did not experience whatever moral recalibration the system may have hoped for. He moved on, and he waited, and 14 years later, he was standing in a clerk's office in Reno with a woman who had auburn hair and a big smile, and no knowledge of what had lived in a septic tank in Seattle. Ruth's nephew Jim Terry, who was a child when she visited the family in Chattanooga in the summer of 1973 or 1974, would say decades later that he remembered a big smile and auburn hair. Her grandniece described her as not being herself whenever Moldavin was around, quieter, more careful. The specific behavioral adjustment that people make in the presence of someone whose reactions they have learned to anticipate and accommodate. She described Moldavin as possessive, not threateningly so, perhaps not in any way that would have produced a specific alarm in the family, possessively in the way that seemed, from the outside, like the attention of a man who was invested in his wife. The kind of behavior that reads differently when you know what it belongs to, and reads as nothing particular when you don't. The family knew Moldavin was an antiques dealer. They knew he was traveling the country looking for inventory, which was plausible and routine for someone in his business. They knew he and Ruth were going to Massachusetts next. Ruth's half-brother, Ken Terry, speaking to the Provincetown Independent decades after the fact, said she was just newly married and she was happy to be going across country. He could not recall Moldavin clearly. The man had left no strong impression on the family, which was itself perhaps a skill, the ability of a certain kind of person to be present without being memorable, to perform the role of pleasant new husband without drawing the scrutiny that a more remarkable presence might attract. At some point in the summer of 1974, Moldavin drove to the dunes at Race Point. He had grown up with knowledge of that geography. His father had owned property in Provincetown. He understood what the dunes provided: distance from the public beach, isolation, miso, the specific privacy of a landscape that absorbs what is left in it. He killed Ruth there, or brought her there already dead. The medical evidence suggests she was killed in her sleep, likely with a blunt instrument. A military-style entrenching tool was one theory investigators advanced. The absence of defensive wounds, the absence of evidence of struggle in the sand around the blanket, supported the conclusion that she did not see it coming. She was asleep on a beach blanket in the dunes in summer, and the person beside her waited until she was not awake, and then did what the physical evidence recorded. Then came the procedure: the removal of the hands, the extraction of several teeth, the arrangements that were made to ensure that the woman left in those dunes would not be identifiable through the means available in 1974. He arranged her body face down on the blanket. He folded her jeans and placed them under her head. He left. He then drove Ruth's car, her own vehicle, her new car, the car she had come to Massachusetts in, back to Tennessee. He went to the family and told Ruth's brother James that they had had a fight during their honeymoon and that he had not heard from his wife since. He told some people she had died. He sold off Ruth's personal belongings. He offered James a story that was designed, with the specific precision of someone who had done this before, to be believed. And James Terry, who had no reason to know what had happened to his second wife's body in a septic tank in Seattle in 1960, believed it, at least initially. He hired a private investigator. He went to California looking for her. He found nothing. Because the person who had taken his sister had arranged for there to be nothing to find. Ruth was never reported to authorities as a missing person. This detail appears in the investigative record without extensive commentary, but it carries weight. It means that in 1974, when Provincetown police were trying to match an unidentified dead woman to missing persons reports, Ruth Marie Terry's name was not in the database. Moldavin had managed the narrative of her absence well enough that the administrative machinery that might have connected the woman in the dunes to the woman who had left Tennessee with him never received the information it needed to make that connection. In the years that followed, the Lady of the Dunes became one of the most haunting cold cases in Massachusetts history, and one of the most investigated, and one of the most frustrating in the specific way that a case is frustrating when investigators believe they are looking at an answerable question and cannot find the answer. In 1980, 6 years after her burial, the body was exhumed for the first time. Forensic investigators took blood samples. The samples yielded the blood type, but nothing further that the technology of 1980 could extract and use. The exhumation produced no new identification leads. She went back into the ground under the same marker. In the years between 1974 and the 1990s, Dozens of possible identities were investigated and eliminated. A woman who had escaped from the Provincetown jail in 1974 and disappeared, whose physical description was consistent, was investigated and ruled out. A Canadian woman told a friend that she had seen her father strangle a woman in Massachusetts around 1972. Police attempted to locate this woman and could not find her. The lead dissolved. 2 other missing women, Frances Ewalt of Montana and Vicki Lamberton of Massachusetts, were investigated as strong possibilities and eliminated through investigation. Each promising lead required investigators to begin from the point of a known absence, a woman who had been reported missing somewhere, and work backward toward the dunes. Without Ruth Terry's name in any missing persons report, that methodology could never reach her. A clay facial reconstruction was produced, the painstaking work of a forensic artist taking the skull's dimensions and geometry and reconstructing around them the approximation of a face. The reconstruction circulated. It was shown to the public in various forms. No one recognized her, or no one who recognized her came forward, which amounts to the same investigative outcome. The reconstruction was revised over the years, refined with available techniques, age regressed and age progressed. Each version produced a recognizable image of a woman with auburn hair and strong features. None of the images produced a name. In 2000, the body was exhumed a second time, this time to obtain a DNA sample in the hope of matching it against a specific suspect, Rory Jean Kessinger, an inmate who had escaped from a Plymouth correctional facility months before the murder. The DNA comparison eliminated Kessinger. The second exhumation yielded no identification breakthrough. The DNA sample existed in the Massachusetts forensic system as a profile with no match. A record of who she was at the molecular level, waiting for something to compare it against. This is the specific quality of cold case investigation in the pre-genealogy era that the Lady of the Dunes case illustrates with particular clarity. Investigators were not failing. They were working consistently and with genuine commitment. The Provincetown Police Chief James Meads, who spent 2 decades trying to discover her identity, was by all accounts a man who had made this case a personal mission, who carried it not as a closed file, but as an open obligation. The Massachusetts State Police were involved. The FBI reviewed the case periodically. None of this produced an identification, because the investigation was structured around a methodology that could not work given the specific nature of what had been done to Ruth Terry. The methodology was, find someone who was reported missing, whose physical description matches the victim, and then confirm through identity documents, dental records, or fingerprints. Muldaven had eliminated 2 of those 3. And the third, missing persons reports, required that someone had reported Ruth missing, which nobody had, because Muldaven had managed her family's understanding of her disappearance well enough to forestall that. The investigation was perfect in its own terms. Its terms were simply not adequate to reach the truth that had been hidden from them. The gap was not between effort and outcome. The gap was between the available technology and the problem in front of it, a gap that would not close until the era of consumer DNA databases and forensic genealogy arrived and rewrote what was possible. The 1990s were also the decade in which the investigation's most celebrated false lead arrived in the form of a theory that the Lady of the Dunes had briefly been visible to millions of moviegoers. In 1974, Steven Spielberg had been filming Jaws on Martha's Vineyard, approximately 100 miles from Provincetown. In 2015, author Joe Hill, the son of Stephen King, noticed that a female extra in a crowd scene in Jaws appeared to closely resemble the clay reconstructions of the Lady of the Dunes, down to the similar clothing description, jeans and a blue bandana. The theory spread across the true crime community with the speed that compelling coincidences spread in the social media era. It was not proven. It was not definitively disproven. What it was, above all, was a reflection of how desperately people wanted to give this woman an origin story, a moment of visible life in the year she died, a confirmation that she had existed in the world before she was erased from it. The film frame became, for a period, the closest thing the case had to a photograph. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, the case accumulated theories that gained traction and then dissolved. Serial killer Haddon Clark confessed to the murder in 2004. Clark was a paranoid schizophrenic who had committed other murders, and the confession was investigated. It could not be corroborated. It could not be disproven. It was filed. The Boston organized crime figure James Whitey Bulger, who had operated in the Cape Cod area during this period and was known to have murdered women and extracted their teeth to prevent identification, Whitey was investigated as a possible suspect. His method of erasing identity matched the method used in the dunes. The connection was taken seriously. It was never proven, and the identification of Ruth Terry as the victim, married to Guy Moldavin, effectively removed Bulger from the primary suspect framework. Meanwhile, Guy Rockwell Moldavin was alive. He was living in California. Between his release in 1962 and his marriage to Ruth Terry in 1974, he had moved through the years with the practiced mobility of a man who understood that distance from his history was itself a form of protection. He had changed names before. He had constructed identities before. The antique dealing was real enough. He had genuine knowledge of the trade, genuine expertise, the kind that provides both a livelihood and a cover story simultaneously. And a reason to be in any city acquiring and selling objects, a plausible reason to travel. He inhabited the role of the charming, brilliant, slightly eccentric antiques man in the way that certain people inhabit roles, completely without visible seam. The people who encountered him in the years after 1962 and before 1974 encountered a man who had committed 3 murders and served time for theft, and was, on every observable surface, simply an interesting person who knew a great deal about antiques and had a gift for conversation. He was, by available accounts, exactly the kind of man he had always been. An antiques dealer, a charmer, a person who moved through the world with the specific confidence of someone who had assessed the limits of what could be done to him and found those limits sufficient. He died in California in 2002, and a free man. He died 2 decades before the technology that would have connected his name to the beach blanket in the dunes existed in a form that investigators could deploy. He died without having been charged with the murder of Ruth Marie Terry, without having been charged with the murders of Manzanita Ryan and Dolores Mearns in Seattle in 1960, without ever having spent a meaningful period of time inside the legal consequences of the harm he had done. The grand larceny conviction and its truncated sentence were the sum total of what the justice system extracted from a man who dismembered at least 3 women across 14 years. The technology that finally gave Ruth Terry her name back is called investigative genetic genealogy. It combines DNA analysis with traditional genealogy research and historical records to generate investigative leads when conventional database matching has failed. The technique had been used to dramatic effect in the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018, which announced to the world that a new investigative era had begun, one in which even decades-old biological material could be traced back to a family, and from a family back to an individual, through the accumulating genealogical databases that commercial DNA testing companies had been building for years. In 2021, investigators submitted skeletal material from the Lady of the Dunes to Othram Inc., a private laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, that specializes in forensic DNA analysis for cold cases. Multiple extractions were attempted on different parts of the remains to maximize the quality of the genetic profile obtained. Othram succeeded in generating a usable profile. The profile was then analyzed using genetic genealogy methodology, comparing it against the growing databases of consumer DNA tests submitted to companies like Ancestry and 23andMe by people who were not suspects but who were simply curious about their heritage and who did not know that their genetic contribution to those databases would one day help identify the grandmother or aunt or cousin they had never met. Ruth Terry's son, Richard Hanchett, had taken a DNA test through Ancestry.com in 2018, looking for the birth mother he had never met. That test and I combined with DNA contributions from other members of the Terry family, including Ruth's half-brother Ken and his son Jim Terry, provided the genealogical scaffolding that genetic genealogy could work with. The DNA profile from the skeletal remains matched a pattern consistent with the Terry family. The investigators worked the genealogy backward and forward, building the family tree in both directions, until the profile resolved into a specific person, Ruth Marie Terry, born September 8, 1936, in Whitwell, Tennessee. The official announcement came on October 31, 2022, Halloween. The FBI's Boston Division, the Massachusetts State Police, the Provincetown Police Department, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts held a press conference and announced that after 48 years, Terry, the oldest unidentified homicide victim in Massachusetts, finally had her name. FBI Special Agent in Charge Joseph Bonavolanta said, "This is, without a doubt, a major break in the investigation that will hopefully bring all of us closer to identifying the killer." He said, "Ruth was a daughter, sister, aunt, wife, and mother." He said her family had been told that morning before the public announcement. He said if Ruth Marie hadn't met her assailant in 1974, she could be 86 years old today. Cape and Islands District Attorney Michael O'Keefe said, "It's very likely that the person who did this is dead, but they may not be. So the message to them, if they're still out there, is, we're coming." Guy Muldavin had been dead for 20 years. He was not there to receive the message. The message was delivered anyway, into the public record. Because some messages are not for their addressees. Some messages are for the families of the people who were killed. Some messages are for the community that had given the Lady of the Dunes a name it was not hers and had been trying for 48 years to find the real one. Some messages are for the woman in the ground at St. Peter's Cemetery, who had been lying under a marker that read, "Unidentified female body since July 1974, and who now had her name." In 2023, investigators formally closed the case. The Cape and Islands District Attorney's Office stated officially that Guy Muldavin was responsible for Ruth Terry's death in 1974. The statement also identified him as a suspect in the deaths of Manzanita Ryan and Dolores Mearns in Seattle in 1960. It said, in the careful but unambiguous language of a prosecutorial conclusion that cannot produce a prosecution because the subject is dead. Based on the investigation into the death of Ms. Terry, it has been determined that Mr. Muldavin was responsible for Ms. Terry's death in 1974. The case was closed. No trial occurred. No conviction was entered. The man who had murdered at least 3 women, who had dismembered bodies and sealed them in concrete, who had amputated hands and extracted teeth to ensure anonymity, who had driven his wife's car back to her family in Tennessee and told them they had a fight on their honeymoon, who had sold her personal belongings and moved on and lived for 28 more years after leaving Ruth on a beach blanket in the dunes. That man was never convicted of any of it. He was convicted of stealing $10,000 in 1961 and he was released in 1962, and the rest is what happened. Richard Hanchett, Ruth Terry's son, was 64 years old when the identification was announced. He had spent years looking for the birth mother who had given him up for adoption in 1958 because she could not afford to keep him, who had arranged his placement with the people she trusted, who had tried to reach him again in 1972, who had been killed before the attempt at reunion could resolve into anything. He found out, in the manner of all the worst discoveries, that the search had been over for decades, that the resolution he was looking for had a specific location in a Provincetown cemetery and a specific date on its marker, July 26, 1974. He went to Provincetown after the identification. He met with Alyssa Metcalf, whose late sister Leslie had been the 12-year-old girl who found the body in the dunes. The two families, the one that had lost Ruth Terry and the one that had carried the weight of the discovery for 48 years, sat together. What that conversation contained is not public. What it represented is the human end of a case whose other end is the septic tank in Seattle, and the two poles are so far from each other that the distance between them is almost impossible to hold in mind at once. Ken Terry, Ruth's half-brother, speaking in the aftermath of the identification, said, It sure gave me the chills when I read about what happened in Seattle. He was referring to Manzanita Ryan and Dolores Mearns. He was referring to the fact that the system had known about this man in 1960, had found pieces of 2 women in his septic tank, and had convicted him of larceny and released him inside of 2 years. He was referring, without using these words, to the specific category of systemic failure in which the law does exactly what it is designed to do, applies the standards that the law requires, and produces a result that allows the wrong person to go free and continue, because the law had done everything correctly while the man inside the law's tolerances had done everything that could be done, without technically meeting the standard required to hold him. There is no one to blame for the prosecution in 1960, making the decision that the evidence was insufficient. The decision may even have been legally correct. The consequence of the decision was Ruth Marie Terry on a beach blanket in 1974, unnamed until 2022. Her marker at St. on Peter's Cemetery in Provincetown has been updated. It now bears her name, Ruth Marie Terry. Born September 8, 1936, in Whitwell, Tennessee. Murdered in the summer of 1974 at the age of 37. She was a daughter and a sister and an aunt and a wife and a mother. She had auburn hair and a big smile. She had a nephew who remembered those things 50 years later and whose voice broke when he said them. She had a son who spent years looking for her and found out she had been in a cemetery in Massachusetts since before he started looking. She had a name. She was always Ruth Marie Terry. The Dunes held her under a different name for 48 years, and the science that gave her name back was not available in 1974 or 1984 or 1994 or even 2004, when the man who had taken her name from her died in 2002, knowing that the tools to restore it did not yet exist, calculating correctly that he had won the race between what he had done and what could be proven. He was right. He won the race. He died a free man. He was wrong about permanence. Ruth Marie Terry's name was restored on October 31st, 2022, to a family that had been waiting for it since the summer of 1974. Science had caught up to what he had done to her, not in time for accountability, in time, at least, for her name. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact the FBI's toll-free tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI, 1-800-225-5324, the Massachusetts State Police at 1-800-KAPTURE, 1-800-527-8873, or submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov.